In 1922, a man stood on the deck of a sinking ship in the middle of the Antarctic ice, and instead of explaining himself to anyone, instead of justifying the decision that had just cost him his vessel, he turned to his crew and said 3 words that changed the course of human survival. Ship and stores. That's it. No defense. No apology. No attempt to convince the men around him that he had done everything right. Ernest Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, was being crushed by ice 1,000 miles from any rescue, the timbers groaning and splitting under pressure that sounded, by the accounts of the men who heard it, like artillery fire echoing across a frozen sea. He had spent years building toward this expedition. He had raised the money, recruited the crew, staked his entire reputation as a polar explorer on crossing Antarctica on foot after another team had already claimed the South Pole first. And now the ship that carried his name and his ambition was being splintered apart by ice that didn't care about any of it. In that moment he didn't waste a single second proving that he was still in control, still competent, still worthy of the title of leader. He didn't gather the men and deliver a speech about how this wasn't his fault, didn't try to convince anyone that the ice pack had been unpredictable, didn't look for someone else to blame for the disaster unfolding in front of 28 pairs of eyes. He simply moved forward. He let the ice take the ship and he turned his full attention toward the only thing that mattered, getting his men home alive. This is where we begin, because this is the moment every man eventually has to face. The moment where the thing you built is sinking, where people are watching, where every instinct screams at you to explain yourself, to defend your choices, to prove that you're still worth following. And the men who actually survive these moments are not the ones who prove anything. They're the ones who stop trying to. Stop proving your worth. Not because you don't have worth. Because the moment you start trying to prove it, you've already handed your power to whoever's watching. If this lands with you in any way, subscribe to Inner Steel now, because what you're about to hear isn't motivation, it's a complete rewiring of how you relate to other people's opinions of you, told through the lives of men and women who stopped performing and started living. Let's go back further than Shackleton, back to Rome, back to a young man named Marcus Aurelius who, by the time he was middle-aged, held more raw power than almost any human being in history. Emperor of Rome. Commander of legions stretched across 3 continents. A man whose word could end a life or build a city, who could have any luxury the ancient world had to offer simply by asking for it. He spent much of his reign not in the comfort of the palace but on military campaigns along the Danube frontier, sleeping in army tents, fighting wars he never wanted, while plague swept through the empire behind him. And yet if you read his private notebook, the one historians later called Meditations, you find something almost shocking. You find a man constantly reminding himself not to perform. He wrote to himself, not for an audience, not for senators, not for the mob in the Colosseum, but in the dead of night by lamplight in a military tent on a hostile frontier, with no one watching, that he must stop caring what people think of him and start caring only about whether his actions were just. Here was the single most powerful man on earth, a man who could have spent every waking hour managing his image, parading his victories, justifying his decisions to the Senate and the public, and instead he spent his nights writing reminders to himself to let go of exactly that need. He never intended for these words to be published. He never intended for anyone to read them at all. They were found after his death, and that fact alone tells you everything about what kind of man wrote them, a man building discipline for an audience of one, himself, with no one left to perform for. Marcus understood something most men never figure out even after a lifetime of trying. The need to prove yourself is bottomless. You can win every argument, win every battle, conquer every rival, and the need will still be there the next morning, hungry, asking for more evidence, more proof, more validation. Marcus didn't try to fill that hole. He starved it. Every morning before the sun came up, before the demands of running an empire descended on him, he reminded himself that he did not need the world's approval to know that he had acted with virtue. The approval would come or it wouldn't. Critics would call him weak for showing mercy or call him tyrannical for showing strength, and either way, their verdict changed nothing about what he actually knew to be true about his own conduct. His job was the action, not the audience's reaction to it. This is the first quiet truth buried inside the armor of inner steel. Worth was never something you earned through performance. It's something you stop questioning the moment you decide your own standard matters more than the crowd's applause. Marcus had legions who would have died for him, senators who flattered him, crowds who cheered his name in the streets of Rome, and none of it was the source he drew from when he needed to know whether he had lived that day with integrity. He drew from a standard he had built himself, tested against his own reasoning, written down in private so that no one, not even future readers 2,000 years removed, could accuse him of performing virtue for their benefit. The notebook was never meant to be read. That's exactly why it's worth reading. Now travel 2,000 years forward, into a concentration camp in Nazi-occupied Europe, where a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl was stripped of everything a man could be stripped of. His name was replaced with a number, tattooed and shouted at him by guards who no longer saw a person, only a unit of labor to be worked until it stopped functioning. His possessions were taken on the very first day, down to a manuscript he had spent years writing, the culmination of his professional life's work, confiscated and presumably destroyed within hours of his arrival. His family was scattered, and most of them, he would later learn, did not survive the war at all. Every external marker of his worth, his career, his reputation, his credentials, his wedding ring, all of it confiscated at the gates of Auschwitz, processed and catalogued like the rest of the inventory taken from the thousands who arrived on those trains. And here's the part that should stop you cold. In that place, where every external proof of who he was had been physically removed from his body, Frankl discovered that his sense of worth hadn't actually disappeared. It had simply moved. It had relocated from the outside world into a place the guards could never reach, no matter how thoroughly they searched him, no matter how completely they stripped away everything visible. He started to notice, even in the worst conditions imaginable, working in freezing trenches on starvation rations, that some men gave up entirely the moment their old identities were stripped away. He watched men who had been successful, respected, admired in their previous lives simply stop fighting once the camp removed every external sign of that former status, as if the title and the man had been the same thing all along. Meanwhile other men who had built their sense of self on something deeper than rank or possessions or reputation, kept finding reasons to wake up the next morning, kept finding small ways to retain some shred of dignity even while performing the same backbreaking labor as everyone else. Frankl later wrote about a kind of freedom that no one could take from a man, the freedom to choose his attitude in any given set of circumstances. He wasn't talking about controlling the camp, which was obviously impossible. He wasn't talking about proving anything to the guards or to the other prisoners, since there was no version of proof that would have changed his circumstances by even an inch. He was talking about an internal compass that functioned completely independent of what anyone around him thought, said, or did. The men who survived psychologically, not just physically, were the men who had stopped needing the world to confirm their value a long time before they ever arrived at those gates. That internal foundation had to be built before the test came, because there was no building it once the test had already started. He observed something specific that he carried with him for the rest of his career as a psychiatrist after the war. Among the men who eventually gave up, who simply lay down one day and stopped responding to the world around them, the pattern was almost always the same. They had defined themselves entirely by something external, a career, a social position, a sense of being respected or admired by others, and once the camp removed every trace of that external definition, there was nothing left underneath it to hold them up. The men who endured, by contrast, tended to be the ones who had already located some source of meaning that didn't depend on an audience at all, a relationship they held in memory, a piece of work left unfinished that they were determined to return to, a private sense of purpose that the guards could threaten but never actually touch, because it had never been built where the guards could reach it in the first place. This is the part of Frankl's account that should unsettle anyone who has built their entire identity on being seen a certain way by other people. It's not a hypothetical warning. It's a documented pattern, observed under the most extreme conditions human beings have ever endured, that worth built on an audience collapses the instant the audience is removed, while worth built on an internal standard survives almost anything, because it was never actually dependent on anyone else's eyes in the first place. If your sense of who you are can be destroyed by someone removing your job title, your relationship, your social media following, or your reputation among people who barely know you, then you were never standing on solid ground to begin with. You were standing on rented land, and rent can be raised, and leases can be cancelled, and landlords change their minds. This is Inner Steel. If it's hitting something real in you right now, hit subscribe, because the next story is about a woman who refused to perform fear on command, and what happened after she made that choice rewired an entire country. December 1st, 1955, Montgomery, Alabama. The workday is ending, the bus is filling up at the front the way it always does, and a bus driver named James Blake tells a woman in the first row of the colored section to give up her seat to a white passenger. Her name is Rosa Parks, and what almost nobody remembers correctly about this moment is that she wasn't loud. She didn't make a speech. She didn't try to prove a point to the bus full of strangers around her. She simply said no, quietly, and stayed seated, looking out the window while the driver threatened to call the police, and then while he actually did. History books often paint this as a single spontaneous act of defiance, and in a sense it was, but the internal experience was something far more interesting than defiance. Parks had spent years as an NAACP organizer, working quietly behind the scenes investigating cases of violence against black citizens long before her name became attached to a bus boycott. She had seen the system up close, had watched how it operated, had already done the harder, less glamorous work of understanding exactly what she was up against. By the time she sat on that bus, she wasn't performing courage for an audience. She wasn't trying to prove she was brave. She had simply, quietly, internally decided, likely long before that particular evening, that her dignity was not up for a vote, not from the driver, not from the other passengers, not from the laws of the state of Alabama. Notice what she didn't do. She didn't argue with Blake. She didn't try to win over the white passengers sitting near the front, didn't need them to agree with her, didn't need the driver to suddenly see reason and validate her decision, didn't even need the other black passengers on that bus to rise up and back her in the moment, though some accounts say a few quietly got off the bus in solidarity once they saw what was happening. She made her decision based on an internal standard that had nothing to do with whether anyone around her approved of it in real time. That's the part of the story that gets lost. We remember Rosa Parks as a hero of the movement, which she was, but we forget that the entire act was born from someone who had already stopped needing outside permission to know she was right. She got arrested that night, fingerprinted and processed like a criminal for the simple act of staying seated. She lost her department store job not long after. She and her husband eventually had to leave Montgomery entirely because of the threats that followed them for years. None of that was the reward. The boycott that followed, lasting 381 days and crippling the city's bus revenue, the legal victories that eventually struck down segregated seating, the entire trajectory of the civil rights movement that gained momentum from that single quiet refusal, none of it came because Parks proved anything to anyone on that bus. It came because she stopped trying to. You will face smaller versions of that bus every single day. A boss who expects you to shrink. A room full of people who expect you to laugh along with something that violates what you actually believe. A relationship that asks you to perform a version of yourself you don't recognize anymore. The instinct will always be to explain, to justify, to convince the room that your boundary is reasonable. Stop. You don't need the room's permission. You need your own clarity. This is what real discipline sounds like when it's stripped of motivational noise. It's not loud. It's not aggressive. It's a quiet, internal no that doesn't require anyone else's agreement to be valid. If you're starting to feel the shape of this philosophy taking hold in you, subscribe to Inner Steel, because we're about to go into a Vietnamese prison cell, and what one man did there with absolutely no audience at all is going to redefine what you think discipline even means. His name was James Stockdale, a Navy pilot shot down over North Vietnam in September 1965 while flying a mission over enemy territory, ejecting from his aircraft into a small village where he was beaten, his leg broken, and dragged off to begin what would become more than 7 years of captivity in a prison the Americans bitterly called the Hanoi Hilton. Tortured repeatedly, kept in isolation for long stretches, placed in leg irons in a windowless cell for 2 years straight at one point. No access to news, no access to family, no way of knowing if the war would end in a month or a decade, no way of knowing if he would ever leave that cell alive, and as the senior-ranking officer among the American prisoners, no way of escaping the responsibility he felt for the men suffering alongside him. Stockdale later described something that became known as the Stockdale paradox, and it has nothing to do with proving toughness to his captors. He said the prisoners who survived weren't the optimists who told themselves they'd be out by Christmas, because when Christmas came and went, and then came and went again, those men's spirits broke in a way that was almost worse than not having hoped at all. And it wasn't the pure pessimists either, the ones who decided early on that they would never make it out, because they simply gave up, stopped eating, stopped fighting the slow erosion of captivity. The men who survived were the ones who held two things at once, seemingly contradictory things: a brutal, unflinching acceptance of the reality they were in, the torture, the uncertainty, the very real chance they would die in that cell, combined with an unshakable, almost irrational faith that they would eventually prevail and that the broader meaning of their suffering mattered. Here's what's easy to miss in this story. Stockdale wasn't performing resilience for the guards. There was no audience for his suffering that mattered to his survival, no camera capturing his composure, no journalist waiting outside the walls to record his bravery. He wasn't trying to prove to his captors that they couldn't break him, even though, in the end, they couldn't. He developed an internal system instead, tapping codes on cell walls to communicate with other prisoners using a method based on the alphabet, building a private chain of command among the captured men even while physically isolated from nearly all of them, an entire structure of meaning and discipline that existed purely because it served his own ability to survive with his mind intact and help the other prisoners do the same. None of it required validation from anyone outside that prison. None of it was for show, because there was, quite literally, no one to show it to. This is the brutal version of stopping the need to prove yourself. It's not just a mindset for comfortable men dealing with social anxiety at a dinner party. It's the same exact mechanism that kept a man's mind from disintegrating in a box for 7 years. The need to prove something to an audience is, at its core, a need for that audience to exist and to matter. Take away the need for the audience entirely, and you become almost impossible to break, because there's no leverage left for anyone to pull. Stockdale himself later wrote about the danger of false hope far more than he wrote about the danger of despair, because despair, in his experience, was at least honest about the situation. False hope was the trap that destroyed otherwise strong men, because it required a constant, exhausting performance of optimism for an audience of fellow prisoners and, more dangerously, for themselves, a performance that could not be sustained once reality refused to cooperate with the timeline they had promised everyone, including their own minds. The men who survived best were the ones who let go of the performance altogether and simply did the next necessary thing, one day at a time, without needing the story to resolve on any particular schedule. Most men reading or listening to this will never face a prison cell in Vietnam. But you face smaller cells every day, cells built from the opinions of coworkers, the judgment of family members, the algorithm's verdict on your last post. The architecture is the same. The only difference is the stakes. Build the internal structure now in a smaller version of the test, so it's already standing when the bigger version eventually arrives. This channel is built for men doing exactly that. If that's you, make sure you're subscribed to Inner Steel, because the next part of this story takes us to a man who turned the entire idea of needing approval into something almost laughable, and he did it through nothing but sheer repetition. David Goggins grew up in a house where he watched his father beat his mother, where fear ran through the walls like electricity, where a young boy learned early that approval was something you begged for and rarely received, and where even basic safety was never guaranteed from one night to the next. He carried that wiring into adulthood, overweight at nearly 300 pounds, directionless, working night shifts as an exterminator, spraying pesticide in other people's kitchens while quietly hating the man he saw in the mirror every single morning, a man who felt nothing like the person he believed he was capable of becoming. Here's where most versions of this story go wrong. People love to tell the part where Goggins transformed his body, lost over 100 pounds in roughly 3 months to qualify for Navy SEAL training, passed that training on his third attempt after washing out twice from injury and exhaustion, became an ultra-endurance athlete who ran 100-mile races on stress fractures, once running over 100 miles on a torn meniscus with kidney damage so severe that doctors later found his kidneys functioning at a fraction of capacity. But that's not actually the engine of the story. The engine is what happened in his head long before any of that physical transformation, which is that he stopped needing anyone to believe he could do it before he started trying. Goggins talks about something he calls the accountability mirror, where he would stand in front of his own reflection, often at 3 or 4 in the morning before anyone else in the house was awake, and have brutally honest conversations with himself, completely alone, no audience, no camera, no one to perform for, just a man and the version of himself staring back. He wasn't trying to convince his commanding officers he deserved to be there during Hell Week, when instructors and most of the other candidates assumed he would quit like he nearly had before. He wasn't trying to prove anything to the other SEAL candidates dropping out around him in the freezing surf off the coast of California. He was having an argument with the only person whose opinion of him actually mattered, which was himself, in the dark, with nobody else in the room to witness whether he won that argument or lost it. There's a phrase he became known for: callousing the mind. The idea that just like skin toughens under repeated friction until it can withstand what used to tear it open, your mind toughens under repeated voluntary discomfort, and that toughness doesn't come from anyone clapping for you while it happens. It comes from doing the hard thing in the dark, with no praise waiting at the end of it, purely because you told yourself, hours or days earlier, that you would. This is the part of inner steel philosophy that separates men who talk about discipline from men who actually have it. Discipline performed for an audience is theater. Discipline practiced in private, where no one will ever know if you skipped it, where no one will ever applaud you for showing up, that's the real thing. That's the version that builds an unshakable foundation, because it was never built on the audience to begin with. It can't collapse when the audience leaves, because the audience was never load-bearing. Think about how differently most men approach their own goals compared to how Goggins approached his. Most men need someone to know they're trying before they'll commit fully, posting the workout plan, announcing the diet, telling friends about the new habit, because some part of them is using the audience as a substitute for actual resolve, borrowing motivation from the fear of public failure rather than generating it from within. Goggins built a version of himself that required none of that borrowed fuel. The 3 a.m. conversations with the mirror were not rehearsals for a future performance. They were the entire performance, complete and finished the moment they happened, regardless of whether a single other person on earth ever found out about them. If you're building that kind of foundation right now, that's exactly what this channel exists for. Subscribe to Inner Steel and let's keep going, because the next story takes place on a track in England in 1954, where a medical student did something doctors had insisted for years was physically impossible for the human body. For decades, the 4-minute mile was considered an absolute ceiling, not just a difficult target, but a biological wall, something scientists genuinely believed the human body could not cross without serious risk of heart failure. Roger Bannister, a 25-year-old medical student training in his spare time, without a professional coach, without sponsorship, without any of the modern apparatus we associate with elite athletics, decided to try anyway. What's often left out of this story is the sheer weight of public opinion stacked against him. Sports journalists openly mocked the attempt, framing it as the folly of an amateur with delusions of grandeur. Rival runners and even some respected physicians were on record saying the human heart would not survive the strain of running that fast for that long, that some biological ceiling would crush the lungs or seize the heart before a man could complete it. Bannister trained largely alone, sometimes on his lunch breaks from medical school, squeezing in interval sessions on a cinder track between lectures and hospital rounds, with 2 friends, Chris Brasher and Chris Chataway, serving as his pacers. There was no stadium full of fans cheering him toward history that day, no broadcast deal, no crowd whose belief he needed to borrow in order to find his own. On May 6, 1954, at a windy track in Oxford called Iffley Road, with a small crowd of around 3,000 people who had no idea they were about to witness one of the most famous athletic achievements of the century, in conditions so poor that Bannister nearly called off the attempt entirely, he ran the mile in 3 minutes and 59.4 seconds. He didn't need the experts to believe it was possible before he did it. He needed to believe it himself, train as if it were already true, and let his body catch up to a conviction his mind had already settled months earlier. Here's what's almost more important than the record itself. Once Bannister broke that barrier, the supposedly impenetrable wall, other runners broke it within weeks. An Australian named John Landy ran an even faster mile just 46 days later. The 4-minute mile had never actually been a physical wall. It had been a psychological one, reinforced by every expert and skeptic insisting it couldn't be done, repeated so often and with such authority that an entire generation of runners had unconsciously accepted it as biological fact rather than untested assumption. The moment one man stopped needing permission from the collective consensus, the entire ceiling that had stood for decades evaporated almost overnight for everyone who came after him. This is what happens every single time a man stops outsourcing his sense of what's possible to the opinions of people who have never attempted the thing themselves. The crowd will always tell you what they believe is the limit. The crowd is almost always wrong, not because they're stupid, but because they're describing the limits of their own imagination, not the limits of reality. Bannister didn't argue with the skeptics. He didn't try to convince the journalists before the race. He simply ran, and the result argued for him. There's a particular kind of confidence that only develops when you stop waiting for the room to agree with you first. The physicians who insisted the human heart would fail were not lying or acting in bad faith. They genuinely believed what they were saying, based on the data available to them at the time. Bannister's achievement wasn't an argument that they were stupid. It was proof that their data was simply incomplete, that the actual ceiling had never been tested by someone willing to find out for himself instead of accepting second-hand conclusions about his own body's limits. You don't need consensus before you attempt the thing that matters to you. You need conviction, training, and a willingness to let the results speak after the fact instead of trying to win the argument before you've even started. If that idea is rearranging something inside you right now, subscribe to Inner Steel, because next we're going back even further, into a Roman exile, where a man stripped of his political career and forced into isolation wrote some of the most enduring wisdom in human history, purely for an audience of one person who would likely never even read it the way he intended. Seneca was a statesman, playwright, and advisor to emperors, a man with immense public standing in Rome, tutor to a young Nero before things between them soured, until politics turned against him and he was exiled to the island of Corsica, cut off from the Senate, the courts, the social fabric of Roman life that had defined his entire identity up to that point. Banishment in the Roman world was not a minor inconvenience. It meant total removal from the networks of influence, friendship, and status that a man like Seneca had spent decades building. For a man whose worth had been built on public position, exile should have been a kind of death, a slow erasure of everything that had made him who he was in the eyes of Rome. Instead, Seneca used the isolation to write some of his most important philosophical letters, many addressed to a friend named Lucilius, walking through ideas about how to handle loss, how to handle the opinions of others, how to face mortality without flinching, all while having absolutely no certainty that exile would ever end. In one of these letters he makes an observation that cuts directly against everything the ancient Roman world valued, the idea that you should regulate your life according to the example and opinion of others rather than according to right reason, a society obsessed with public honor and status whispering back at him through his own pen that the entire premise was backward. What's notable is that Seneca wrote much of this while having no certainty he would ever return to public life, no certainty anyone of consequence would read his words, no guarantee of vindication. He wasn't performing wisdom for an audience that was watching him in real time, because there was no audience left, only the empty stretch of an island and a handful of letters sent across the water to a friend who might, or might not write back. He was working out, in private, the actual architecture of how to live without needing Rome's approval to know his thinking had value. Later in life, after returning to influence as an advisor to Nero, Seneca would eventually be forced to take his own life on the emperor's order, accused of conspiracy in circumstances that remain murky even now. Accounts from the time describe him facing the end with the same composure he had written about for years, comforting the people around him rather than the other way around. Whatever you make of the historical details, the through-line of his life is consistent, a man who spent his most difficult seasons building an internal compass precisely because the external world kept proving how unreliable it was as a source of validation. As a source of validation. This is the lesson buried in exile, in sudden political collapse, in any moment when the crowd that used to applaud you disappears overnight. If your worth was built on their applause, their disappearance destroys you. If your worth was built on your own clear reasoning about how to live, their disappearance is just weather. Inconvenient, maybe even painful, but not fatal. If you've made it this far into this script, subscribe to Inner Steel right now, because the next story goes back even further than Seneca, all the way to a man who took the entire concept of needing the world's approval and threw it into the gutter, quite literally, in the middle of one of the most famous cities in the ancient world. His name was Diogenes of Sinope, and by the time history remembers him, he was living in a large ceramic storage jar in the marketplace of Athens, owning almost nothing, having given away the comfortable life he could have had in pursuit of something he considered far more valuable, complete independence from what anyone else thought of him. Athens at the time was a city obsessed with status, with rhetoric, with the careful management of public reputation among the wealthy and the powerful. Diogenes walked through the middle of it carrying a lamp in broad daylight, telling anyone who asked that he was looking for an honest man, a pointed insult aimed at a society he considered drowning in performance and pretense. The story that captures him best involves Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the known world at that point, conqueror of an empire stretching from Greece to India, a man whose mere presence caused kings to grovel. Alexander, curious about the philosopher everyone talked about, traveled to see Diogenes for himself, found him lying in the sun, and asked if there was anything the most powerful man alive could do for him. Diogenes' reported response was simple. He asked Alexander to move slightly, because he was blocking the sunlight. No request for gold. No request for favor or protection. No attempt to flatter the conqueror standing in front of him, or to extract anything from the encounter that might improve his own standing. Alexander, by most accounts, walked away remarking that if he hadn't been born Alexander, he would have wanted to be Diogenes, a strange kind of respect paid by the most validated man on earth to the one man who had made himself completely immune to needing that validation. What makes Diogenes useful here isn't the eccentricity of living in a jar, which can easily be dismissed as a stunt. It's the underlying mechanism. He had identified correctly that almost every form of suffering he saw around him in Athens traced back to people organizing their entire lives around managing what other people thought of them, accumulating wealth they didn't need to signal status they hadn't earned, performing virtues they didn't actually hold because an audience expected to see them. He stripped all of that away from his own life deliberately, not because poverty was noble in itself, but because he wanted to find out what was left of a man once you removed every external prop holding up his sense of worth. What was left, in his case, was someone who could tell the most powerful man on earth to get out of his light, and mean it, and feel nothing but the simple satisfaction of having spoken the truth as he saw it. You don't need to live in a jar to apply this. You need to ask yourself the same question Diogenes effectively asked himself: how much of what you currently chase, the car, the title, the version of yourself you present online, is actually serving you, and how much of it exists purely because you believe someone else is watching and judging the answer? Strip away the audience in your imagination for a moment. Would you still want the thing? If the answer is no, you've found a part of your life built entirely on performance, and Diogenes would tell you, quite bluntly, to put it down. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, much of it on Robben Island, doing hard labor in a lime quarry that damaged his eyesight permanently from the relentless glare off the white stone, allowed only rare visits and rare letters, often heavily censored, from the family he had left behind. For nearly 3 decades, the world outside continued without him. Governments changed. Technology changed almost beyond recognition. An entire generation was born and grew up never having seen him outside of old photographs and the testimony of others who remembered him from before his imprisonment, a man frozen in time for the public while the actual man aged and endured inside a small cell. Here's the detail that matters most for this conversation. Mandela had no guarantee, for most of those 27 years, that he would ever be released, let alone that he would become president of a transformed South Africa. He was not enduring prison because he was confident the ending would justify it. For most of that sentence, the apartheid government showed no sign of weakening, and there was every reason to believe he would die behind those walls exactly as the state intended. He had no way of knowing the ending at all. He kept his discipline, his reading, his organizing among fellow prisoners, his daily structure, the small dignities he insisted on maintaining even in a system designed to strip every prisoner of dignity, without the reward of knowing any of it would ever pay off in a way the outside world could see or applaud. When he finally walked out of prison in 1990, what struck observers most wasn't bitterness, though he had every reason for it. It was an almost eerie absence of the need to make anyone pay for what had been taken from him. He didn't need the architects of apartheid to grovel before him to feel that his decades of suffering had been validated. He pursued reconciliation instead of vengeance, a decision that confused and even angered some of his own supporters who felt he should have demanded more, made his oppressors suffer the way he had suffered, proven through their punishment that his cause had been right all along. Mandela didn't need that proof. 27 years inside a cell had already burned away whatever part of him once might have needed external validation to know his cause was just. He didn't require the world's apology. He required only that the work of building something better actually get done, and he understood that vengeance would have made that work impossible. Consider what reconciliation actually cost him in terms of political capital. He had spent nearly 3 decades as a prisoner of a system that had tortured, imprisoned, and killed thousands of people who shared his cause, a system that had stolen the better part of his own life from him without ever once offering an apology for it. When he became president, he had every tool available to extract some measure of revenge, legal, political, even simply rhetorical. Instead, he established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that offered amnesty to perpetrators in exchange for honest testimony, prioritizing the country's ability to move forward over his own, or anyone else's, desire to see the guilty punished. He invited his former jailers to his presidential inauguration. He wore the jersey of the national rugby team, long a symbol of white Afrikaner identity and a sport most black South Africans associated with their oppressors, in a calculated act designed to fold a divided country back together rather than widen the wound for the satisfaction of being proven right. This is the furthest edge of what it means to stop needing to prove yourself. It's not just refusing to perform for a dinner party or a coworker. At its outer limit, it's refusing to let even the deepest injustice turn into a need for the world's apology before you're willing to move forward and build something worth building. You will likely never face 27 years in a cell. But you may face people who wronged you and never apologize. You may face entire seasons of your life where you did everything right and the world never acknowledged it. The question this story leaves you with is simple. Will you wait for that acknowledgement before you let yourself move forward, or will you build anyway, indifferent to whether the apology ever arrives? We've gone from emperors to prisoners, from a frozen ship in the Antarctic to a quarry on Robben Island, and every single story has pointed at the same target from a different angle. The moment you stop needing the world to confirm your worth is the exact moment you become functionally impossible to control, because there's nothing left for anyone to threaten you with. They can take your reputation and you'll still know what you did. They can take your position and you'll still know what you stand for. They can take your freedom, as it was taken from Mandela and from Stockdale, and they still won't be able to touch the part of you that decided, on your own terms, what you were worth. This is the final story, and it brings us back to the cold water of the Antarctic, back to Shackleton, because there's a part of his story we haven't told yet. After the Endurance was crushed, after the ice took the ship he loved, Shackleton led his 28 men across some of the most brutal terrain on Earth, camping on drifting ice floes for months, hunting seals to survive, eventually launching 3 small lifeboats into freezing seas to reach the barren rock of Elephant Island. From there he selected 5 men to join him on an open boat journey that should not have been survivable, 800 miles across the most violent ocean on the planet, navigating by sextant through hurricane-force swells, to reach a whaling station on South Georgia Island. When they finally landed, they still had to cross an uncharted, glacier-covered mountain range on foot, with no map, no climbing equipment beyond a carpenter's adze and a length of rope, because the only inhabited part of the island lay on the opposite side from where they had come ashore. He arrived at the whaling station looking like a man who had already died and kept walking anyway, hair and beard matted, skin blackened by months of exposure, clothes barely holding together. The station manager, a man named Thorolf Sorel who had known Shackleton personally before the expedition began, didn't even recognize him at first, and reportedly had to be told who was standing in front of him before he believed it. When Shackleton finally secured rescue and returned, against every reasonable expectation, for every single man he had left behind on Elephant Island, all 28 members of the original expedition survived, an outcome almost nobody in the world believed possible given what they had endured. And here is the detail that matters most. He didn't return home and spend his remaining years convincing the world that he was a hero despite having lost the ship, didn't spend his energy defending the decisions that led to the Endurance's destruction in the first place, didn't need newspapers or historians to settle the question of whether the expedition counted as success or failure. He had already done the only thing that mattered to him, which was bringing his men home alive, and whether the world framed the voyage as triumph or catastrophe was, by that point, almost entirely beside the point to him. That's the final shape of this entire philosophy. Worth isn't something the world hands you after you've performed well enough for long enough, after you've collected enough praise or silenced enough critics or won enough arguments to finally feel secure. Worth is something you decide quietly in the moments no one is watching, and then you act from that decision regardless of whether applause ever shows up to confirm it. Marcus Aurelius decided it in his private notebook on a frozen frontier. Frankl decided it in a concentration camp where every external marker of identity had been stripped away. Rosa Parks decided it on a bus seat in Montgomery with no crowd backing her up. Stockdale decided it tapping codes on a prison wall with no one watching but the men suffering beside him. Goggins decided it in front of a mirror at 3 a.m, alone, with no camera running. Bannister decided it on a windy track everyone with credentials said would defeat him. Seneca decided it in exile on an island, writing letters to a friend who might never write back. Diogenes decided it lying in the sun, telling the most powerful man alive to step out of his light. Mandela decided it across 27 years he had no guarantee would ever end, doing the work without the promise of an audience to witness it. And Shackleton decided it on a sinking ship, with nothing left to prove and everything left to do, and then again on an open boat in the worst ocean on Earth, and again on a mountain no one had ever crossed. Stop proving your worth. Start living from it. The audience was never the point, and the moment you genuinely stop needing one, you'll find there was nothing missing in you to begin with. You were just looking in the wrong direction for the answer, scanning the faces of people whose opinion was never qualified to settle the question in the first place. If this changed something in how you carry yourself today, subscribe to Inner Steel, because this is exactly the kind of philosophy we build, story by story, man by man, until it becomes who you are instead of something you have to keep reminding yourself to believe.